Hello and welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Sunday in Swanee series. My name is Amy Perry and I'm an adult service specialist with the library. We are honored today to have Dr. D.L. Henderson with us to learn more about exploring African American burial grounds. Dr. D.L. Henderson is a historian, genealogist, and author. She has received the Atlanta Urban Design Commissioner's Jenny D. Thornton Memorial Award to an outstanding preservationist professional and has been recognized by the Atlanta City Council for her contribution to the interpretation of African American history and culture. She is the author of Southview, an African American City of the Dead. She is currently at work on an Afrocentric history of Oakland Cemetery. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Henderson.
Oh, nice applause. That was good. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Amy, for inviting me to speak today. I'm pleased to be able to share some of the research I've been doing on African American burial grounds. Today's presentation focuses primarily on the early history of Oakland Cemetery, a cemetery opened by the City of Atlanta in 1850. Portions of today's presentation are taken from both my previously published book on Southview Cemetery and my upcoming book on Oakland. I'll be reading excerpts from both books during the first portion of the presentation. I'll begin with a story. During the early 19th century, the United States Indian policy focused on the removal of the Muskogee, Creek, and other southeastern tribes to areas beyond the Mississippi River. White settlers began establishing homesteads on the vacated lands, and in the 1830s had begun moving into the area that would become Atlanta. In the summer of 1850, just on the outskirts of the city, 6 enslaved African Americans labored in captivity upon a 100-acre farm. The group consisted of 2 females, ages 65 and 20, along with 4 males, ages 14, 20, 24, and 30. Earlier that year, in the month of May, the farmer's wife had died, and he had made a grave for her on the farm. Only a few weeks later, he had sold the land, including his wife's gravesite, to the City of Atlanta to use for a public burial ground, later known as Oakland Cemetery. No doubt life on the farm was impacted by the death of the farm wife. It was likely that the enslaved women took on additional work in the household, managing the home and taking sole care of the farmer's now motherless children. Most Georgia slaveholders in the mid-19th century held fewer than 5 persons in slavery, so the farmer, a white settler originally from Virginia, was already outside the norm. But by 1860, he would hold title to 11 enslaved black laborers, including 5 children aged 15 and under. According to the 1860 U.S. Agricultural Census, the farmer had also increased his land holdings to 250 acres. The people he held in slavery would have been a major factor in the planting and harvesting of the crops that the farm produced in 1860: 125 bushels of wheat, 1,000 bushels of Indian corn, and 50 bushels of oats. Oakland Cemetery's records show that the white farmer buried at least 3 enslaved people in the black section of the cemetery: 6-year-old Wash, who died of typhoid fever in 1857, 70-year-old Tom, who died of pneumonia in 1863, and an unidentified 16-year-old who was buried in 1864. The farmer himself would join his wife in the cemetery's white section upon his death in 1878. Thus begins the history of Atlanta's oldest cemetery. The story of the white farmer and his wife's burial is well known among those who have an interest in Atlanta history, and specifically in Oakland. The story of stolen land and human slavery is not so well known. The history that I'm now writing about Oakland is the history of people that perhaps not everyone is interested in talking about, but their lives matter because it is their existence and their experiences that have helped shape the cultural landscape of Oakland Cemetery. You were stolen from your homes, but you were never lost. You left behind your stories for us to preserve. You will never be forgotten because your lives mattered. In writing this book, I follow in the footsteps of an early black scholar, Reverend Edward Randolph Carter, who produced 2 Afrocentric histories of Atlanta in the late 19th century. In 1888, Carter published Biographical Sketches of Our Pulpit, a collection of life stories of religious personalities in Atlanta's black churches. In 1894, he published The Black Side, a partial history of business, religious, and educational, the educational side of the Negro in Atlanta, Georgia. That's a long title. These books have provided many historians, including me, with a fine historical foundation for the continuing study of black life in Atlanta. The inspiration for my book derives from Carter's depiction of the black side of Atlanta and the lives of many Atlantans who now reside on the black side of Oakland Cemetery. While some people question the need for separate histories today, it seems to me that researching the unique perceptions and experiences representing the various cultures and birthrights of the people who make up our diverse nation will always be appropriate, relevant, and necessary to enhance our understanding of the historical development of America and ourselves as Americans. Too often, even well-intentioned, inclusive histories will provide inadequate diversity of experience, inaccurate and faulty interpretations of cultural practices, factual yet not truthful representations of historical data, and incomplete outsider perspectives that do not properly address culturally specific circumstances. Afrocentric histories, and indeed any culturally specific history, can provide a corrective balance. Their specific cultural focus allows for more detailed and concentrated content and a deeper, fuller cultural examination and analysis. As Atlanta's oldest cemetery, Oakland became the final resting place for nearly all Atlantans who died between 1850 to 1884, black and white, wealthy and poor, immigrant and American-born. Oakland is a microcosm of the city of Atlanta and thus reflects the city's history and its people. Within Oakland, the historic African American burial ground is a microcosm of black life in Atlanta, and black history is inextricably bound to the history of the city. Until the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Atlanta cemeteries operated by the laws and traditions of the living and separated the races even in death. The history of segregation in Atlanta's cemeteries parallels the history of segregation in the city. Just as tradition and law restricted the choices of African Americans during their lifetimes, traditional burial practices and cemetery ordinances controlled their deaths and burials. In 1852, the Atlanta Cemetery Committee recommended a survey to facilitate the sale of cemetery lots at Oakland. Though the Atlanta Cemetery had been open for more than a year, the initial survey and imperfect layout of the grounds had proven unsatisfactory. Some part of that dissatisfaction may have been the lack of a clearly delineated color line in the cemetery. For the committee also proposed that a portion of the grounds be specifically designated for the purpose of burying the black population. The segregated area came to be known as Slave Square. Remarkably, perhaps, at least to me, the racial segregation of the dead within Oakland is frequently misinterpreted as a form of integration, thought to be in contrast to the prevailing racism of the era. This faulty analysis is apparently based upon the notion that the internal segregation of a cemetery was unusual and somehow less racist than the external segregation of having separate cemeteries for the races. In fact, separating burials by race within the same cemetery dates to colonial times, both in the North and the South. America's early social hierarchy was carried over into the cemetery grounds in the 17th and 18th centuries in Copp's Hill Burial Ground in Boston, the African Burial Ground in New York, and throughout the southern states. Apparently, both free and enslaved African Americans were buried in Slave Square. A 3-week-old infant, James Tate, is listed in Oakland's burial records for 1861 with the notation, quote, free Negro, unquote. But by the end of the Civil War, there were reportedly 860 men, women, and children buried in Slave Square. However, Oakland's records and record keeping during the Civil War was inconsistent and may not reflect the true number of dead in the city cemetery. The first documented burial of an African American at Oakland took place in early 1853 in Slave Square. This is John's story. On Thursday, February 10, 1853, a 14-year-old known only as John was buried in Row 1 South, Grave 1 of the Atlanta Cemetery, Slave Square. John's listing in the cemetery records as the first burial in Slave Square is the only documentation that has yet been identified regarding his short life and death. According to his burial, John was born about 1839 in Fayette County, Georgia, and his cause of death is listed as complicated diseases, a term indicating that young John suffered from various, certainly serious, medical problems prior to his death. Though born in Fayette County, somehow John was brought to Atlanta. In what manner, or for what purpose, or for how long he had resided in Atlanta is unknown. Nothing is known of John's parents or whether he had siblings. His life as an enslaved child, the type of work he performed as a slave, and how this may have contributed to his death remains a mystery. No physical description of John exists, nor is there a record of his medical treatment or the length of time that he might have been suffering from the ailments that eventually caused his death. However, the cemetery record does include the name of John Slaveholder, who would have been required by law to arrange for John's burial. John Slaveholder was a prosperous dry goods merchant and one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta when he died in 1868. He was buried in the white section of the cemetery. The end of the Civil War and the end of slavery created the need for another change in Oakland's landscape. The land for what is now known as the historic African American burial ground at Oakland was acquired in 1866 so that the city's black residents could purchase burial space. The African American burial ground covers approximately 3.5 acres at the rear of the cemetery. Though today the section is considered an integral part of Oakland, in the past it was referred to in the city sexton's reports and in the city council minutes as, quote, the colored cemetery, end quote. Black Atlantans were not permitted to buy burial space in other sections of Oakland until desegregation laws were abolished in the city 100 years later. Located at the northeastern end of the cemetery on a downward slope, the African American burial ground was subject to flooding after heavy rains, an issue that routinely interfered with burials in that section. Finally, an irrigation project was attempted to correct the problem in the 1990s. A few people have suggested that the area was segregated because it was the only space available for purchase at the time. But as you can see on this map, at the same time the historic African burial ground section was acquired by the city, more land was purchased to extend Oakland's for sale to white residents of the city. So that there is no confusion, this area of Oakland was purposely segregated by race in the 19th century and maintained in that manner as its existence today demonstrates. In addition, areas designated for the poor, called Potter's Field, were divided by race as well. Potter's Field is almost 6 acres in size and contains approximately 7,500 unmarked graves. Oakland's records list the name but not the location of the paupers in Potter's Field. This section of Oakland was used until Westview Cemetery opened in 1884 and became the burial ground for Atlanta's poor. This marker was installed in Potter's Field in the late 20th century as a memorial to the citizens of Atlanta who rest in unmarked graves. The term Potter's Field probably comes from the Bible, the Gospel of Matthew 27:7. After Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus Christ, he repents and returns his payment of 30 pieces of silver to the priests before hanging himself. The priests called the coins the price of blood, or blood money, and did not want to put the coins in the temple treasury. So they used them to buy a field where the potters dug their clay and they used the field to bury strangers. In 1870, after much debate over the appropriate location for a memorial to the Confederacy and its fallen soldiers, the base for an obelisk at Oakland was laid in the Confederate burial grounds. Even as Atlanta's white citizens erected a memorial to mourn their dead, in doing so, they also produced a monument to the Lost Cause, which would perpetuate the memory of those who died fighting for the continuation of white supremacy. White Atlantans had been gathering at Oakland since 1866 to salute the Confederate dead and to relive the glory of their memories of the war. During the same period, African Americans were continuing to fight for their civil rights, to gain an education, to work for fair wages, and to vote for equal representation under the law. During the 1870s, the cemetery grounds were benefiting from new landscaping and beautification efforts. In anticipation of increasing demands for burial space, the city councilman and cemetery committee chair, William Gray, proposed a solution to gain additional burial space. He may have also considered that his plan would provide a stricter adherence to the cemetery's segregation policy, because Gray's solution was to eliminate Slave Square. In April 1877, the city council passed Gray's resolution to remove the bodies from Slave Square, level the ground, and divide it for lot sales. As part of the old cemetery, Slave Square was perhaps no longer receiving burials by the late 1870s, or possibly the section was full or nearly so. Regardless, to the city council, Slave Square no doubt represented an opportunity to increase burial space and further define the racial division in the cemetery landscape. At the same time, the city would make a profit of $2,000 from the sale of the renovated burial lots. By order of the Atlanta City Council, the bones and bodies of the individuals removed from Slave Square, including John and nearly 900 others, were to be reburied in the colored pauper grounds, without any distinction of graves, except those who may have headboards who may be interred by themselves. Fieldstones or plants also may have been used to mark graves in Slave Square, but only those graves with headboards met the city's standard for individual reinterment. Apparently, the men, women, and children who had been buried in unmarked graves in Slave Square were relocated anonymously to a mass grave. The exact location of their reburial remains unknown. City Council minutes do not indicate whether public notice was given of the planned exhumation of Slave Square, and no historical evidence of reactions from African Americans was documented. However, in early 1878, Atlanta's black citizens submitted 2 petitions to the Atlanta City Council. According to the minutes of the Atlanta City Council on February 4th, 1878, a petition, quote, by colored people for a lot in Oakland Cemetery, end quote, was submitted to the city for approval. On March 4th, the City Council responded, quote, favorable on petition of Allen Frazier, colored, for separate burial ground, end quote. On February 18th, a second petition was submitted by black citizens asking that they be allowed to have a cemetery of their own exclusively. Details of the actual petition do not survive, but the Atlanta Constitution reported the reading of the petition in the next day's newspaper, stating that, quote, a petition from colored citizens for a separate cemetery bought by themselves, end quote, was submitted to the Atlanta City Council. The timing of the petitions was no doubt related to the destruction of Slave Square. Both groups were seeking to ensure that future burials would not be disturbed and subjected to desecration for the accommodation of white burials. Despite favorable decisions for both petitions, apparently no further action was taken by the city, and Atlanta's black citizens continued to be buried in the segregated burial ground at Oakland until they purchased land for their own cemetery in 1886. The establishment of Southview Cemetery by African Americans promised to provide a respectable place for Christian burials for all people, regardless of race. Southview would soon become the primary burial place for African Americans in Atlanta. In 1889, the city's annual cemetery report described Atlanta's 2 privately owned cemeteries and their racial makeup. Westview, which had opened in 1884, where, quote, white persons can purchase lots, end quote, and Southview, quote, the property of colored people where their dead are buried, end quote. The legalized practice of segregated burials in Atlanta continued until December 1963, when the City Council repealed all ordinances that had mandated the segregation of public facilities, though some whites continued to argue that cemeteries were not public facilities. De facto racial segregation within the city of Atlanta and its cemeteries continued much longer. I'd like to share with you some of the selected interments in Oakland's African American burial ground. These are just some of the people who are buried in the historically black section today, because why aren't they in Slave Square? There is no Slave Square except in our imaginations. So Slave Square, to me, is still, yes? Yeah. Well, except in our imaginations. I like to hold on to that, because Slave Square is still sacred ground for me, for African American history in Atlanta. That's sacred ground. I don't know if you're familiar with burial practices in the 19th century, but from 1853 at least until 1877, there were people who were buried there who were not embalmed. Embalming didn't really become popular in Atlanta and the surrounding areas until the 1880s. Those are the first records I see of embalmers at work in the area. And so unembalmed bodies in the ground, 20 some odd years, and when they cleared the ground, they wouldn't have been able to get everything, of course. The long bones, maybe the skull, arms and legs, that sort of thing. And so the bodies of those enslaved people, and some free people as well, are still there. They're still mixed with that soil. So to me, that is still Slave Square. Recently, just a few years ago, we put up an exhibit panel at that section. So when you visit today, it's not invisible. One of my purposes in working with the foundation for Historic Oakland is to make sure that what lies beneath is still apparent, that we still know about it, that it isn't forgotten. So Slave Square is not forgotten today. We still remember it, and we have put up information about it for people who walk through the cemetery. Previously, you could walk right by that corner where there are white graves now and not know what had happened there before, but we've provided a way to do that. So this presentation today is one of those ways as well. When Southview opened in 1886, several black businessmen who apparently had all been formerly enslaved, that's the oral history for all of those families. One of them was named Jacob McKinley. He's actually buried in Oakland, but he was one of the folks who signed the petition for the charter, and he also was a stockholder in that company as well. So what you'll find between Southview and Oakland, I call it a tale of two cemeteries, because there are graves, there are burials that cross over. Part of the family may be at Oakland, maybe an older generation, younger generation may be at Southview. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. But then I found the opposite as well, where younger generations went back to Oakland to use the lots that were there. So I'm going to tell you about a few of the folks who were buried there that you may already know about, and some that you may not. These are the Butlers. Selena Butler was a Spelman grad. Any Spelman folks in the group? Not today. Was a Spelman grad, and she majored in English, elocution, was a wonderful public speaker, and was also part of the women's movement, and started the Atlanta Women's Club for Black women in Atlanta, and then represented them also at the national conferences. Just on the slide, you'll see President Herbert Hoover elected her or appointed her to the White House Conference on Child Health and Protection. And she also published a monthly paper called The Woman's Advocate, which was about topics that were of interest to Black women. She's also a Georgia Woman of Achievement, which means she's in what's called the Georgia Women's Hall of Fame. It's an organization that celebrates the lives and accomplishments of women in the state of Georgia, people who contributed to the improvement of life in the state. And they choose, I think, maybe 4 or so every year, and she was one of those that's been chosen so far. She also, have you guys heard of the PTA? Everybody knows PTA. If you know anything about Selena Butler, you know that she started the first PTA for African American parents at her child's school in Atlanta. And other schools became interested in that, and so they asked her to help them organize, and so they did. Then folks wanted to have a state organization, so she helped with that. And then they wanted to have a national organization to make sure the states were working together, so she helped with that. So she basically was a founder of the National PTA, which the white organization, when it finally desegregated in 1970, and I do have the century correct, it was 1970, when the organization desegregated, they named her one of the national founders of the PTA because essentially she brought in 30 to 40% of the membership in that organization. Her husband, we'll talk about him too. Her husband was Dr. Henry Butler. He was a graduate of Meharry Medical School in Nashville, which was a historically black college, a medical school, and came to Atlanta in 1890. He opened a drugstore with a partner. It was first black-owned drugstore in Georgia. And in 1895, he helped establish the National Medical Association for African American healthcare professionals. Prior to that, he had helped start the Georgia State Medical Association for black healthcare professionals. Prior to that, he had started the Atlanta Medical Association for black healthcare professionals. See the pattern? He did do it first, but she copied it. Okay. Any questions before I move on? Because I'll let you guys jump in.
So is Butler Street named after them?
No, probably not. Butler Street, Atlanta's been changing street names from the very beginning, all the way back to like 1870s, 1880s. But Butler Street was already Butler Street in, I believe, the 1880s or even as early as 1870s. And remember, I said he came to Atlanta in 1890. Yeah, and he was not born here, didn't live here before that. Yes?
Was the name of this drugstore and its location known?
Yeah, it actually started off with Butler and Slater drugs because Dr. Thomas Heath Slater was a classmate of Dr. Butler's at Meharry. They both decided to come to Atlanta because there weren't very many doctors here. I think there might have been just one at that time, maybe two. So they decided to come together. And within the first few months, they opened started the medical association and then opened the drugstore. It was a great investment for them. But it was the Gate City drugstore, but it was Butler and Slater first. And some people, well, longer story. You'll come back for the Southview lecture. Okay, let's go to any other questions before we go to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So these are they're ledger stones. Ledger stones in a cemetery, they're basically the flat grave covers. They're called ledger stones because there's a lot of room for writing, like the old ledger books that they used to keep for accounting purposes. So that's really the only reason they're called that. So they have various symbols on them. Hers has the Eastern Star symbol, and he was a Mason, so you've got Masonic symbols on his. I just now realized that's not very clear. I actually have not used this particular one in a presentation, but I'll get a better one. Guess what? Cemeteries, you pretty much can always go back and get that perfect shot again. Also, maybe lights a little bit in here. This is Antoine Graves. He built the only mausoleum in the black section of the cemetery. A mausoleum is an above-ground burial chamber. It dates from ancient times. So all the burials, I think there's 6 in there. There are 6 crypts inside. They look like, as one of the 8th graders said last week, they look like drawers, that you could pull out. And that's actually what they look like. So he's buried in there with several other family members. There are some family members buried outside of the mausoleum as well in the ground. But he was a principal of the Houston Street School, also called the Gate City School, which opened in 1881. It was the first African American school in Atlanta that had an African American principal and an all black staff of teachers for black children, okay? So black principal, black teachers, black kids. It was the first time. That was 1881. So don't get confused that this is the first school, because it's not the first one. It's the first one that was all black, basically. He was not the first principal R.H. Carter was the first principal, 1881 to 1884. And then in 1884, Antoine Graves took over and was principal until 1886. In 1886, the city of Atlanta welcomed former Confederate President Jefferson Davis to the city. He came to the city to help erect a monument to Benjamin Harvey Hill. And so everybody was thrilled because this is like the president of the Confederacy, right? So it was a big deal. And they let the kids out of school. They had thousands of school children lining the streets, throwing rose petals into the street for him, praising him. Well, Antoine Graves said that he was not going to attend that parade. He said he would not honor a man who had fought to keep black children enslaved and deprived of an education. And he told his faculty and also the students that they could attend if they wished, but he would not participate. That ended his career at the Houston Street School. He left the city. Some people say he resigned, some people say he was fired, but we do know that he left the city. We don't know where exactly he went, but his granddaughter showed me a letter that had been written to her grandmother from Antoine Graves to say, here's some money for you and the kids. Don't tell anybody where I am. So we do have evidence that he had to leave and then came back at a later time, opened a business office on Wall Street, which had formerly been for whites only, the only people who had offices there. So again, he broke a color line, and he opened a real estate office and made tons of money in real estate. Those are school children. I'm not sure what school that is. I won't say that's Gate City. It's a school. And then, okay, next slide. I try to be factual. Oh yeah, you guys? Sure, you can go back.
The school was called Gate City. The drugstore was Gates.
Well, Gate City was...
Gate City
Yeah, it's a thing in Atlanta. Gate City, Atlanta was called the Gate City. It was supposedly the sort of gateway to the lower South. So that was one of the city nicknames, was Gate City. And so the Gate City Guards, for example, during the Civil War and after, they were a white military group. So white people used it, black people used it. And people think but that's what it is. It was the Gate City. And also the school was on Houston Street, so it was officially called the Houston Street School. I'm not sure why it had both names, but it was on Houston Street. And but it is the same place. I verified that because people kept asking me, it's like, where's this at? It's like, no, it's the same school. It physically is the same school. Other questions? Okay, good question about Gate City because a lot of folks don't know that. This is Carrie Steele Logan. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Carrie Steele Pitts home. It is a home today for children who either have lost their parents or are in a situation where they can't stay in the home, and it is still operating today after opening officially in 1888. She was orphaned during slavery and worked at the railroad depot here in Atlanta, a job she had already had for 16 years in Macon. She worked at the Macon depot. So she moved to Atlanta to be with her son and grandchildren and started working at the depot here as well, where she saw a lot of children who were, just on their own, just hanging out, getting in trouble, and she started taking them to her home. She lived at the corner of Wheat Street and Calhoun. She had purchased a home. And we think, okay, she was a maid essentially at the railroad station. How did she do that? But she saved her money. She also probably got tips from a lot of the white travelers. She basically took care of the ladies' waiting room. This would be white lady. They never say white ladies, but it is. The white ladies' waiting room at the depot. And I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember when there were attendants in bathrooms and you tipped them. Anybody remember that? Okay, some of you do. Some of you are old enough to know that. But and so I'm sure she got lots of tips. So she had a good paying job. In 1880, she purchased that house at a sheriff's sale for $20. So she was a smart lady too, because going to a sheriff's sale was a great way to get a bargain. But in 1880, $20 was still a lot of money. All right. This middle portion you see here is a 27-inch cast bronze sculpture of her. And there are several of these. It's one of four that's on Auburn Avenue. Has anybody seen these before? Have you been down Auburn Avenue to see these? They're grouped along Auburn Avenue, and they were done by Brian R. Owens. And that's an actual picture of her that you see there. So even though she was a maid, look how she's dressed. And I have several photos of her. They're just really head and shoulders portraits, but beautiful dresses, beautiful clothing. So again, you know, we have the stereotype of what a maid looks like, right? That they don't have much money and this sort of thing, but she was able to make a good life for herself and then for all of the children in the orphanage. Okay, Bishop Wesley John Gaines, he was sick as a child, but he apparently learned to read, teach himself to read. Now, Carrie Steele wrote her autobiography, Adventures in the Car Shed. So that was like at the railroad. She wrote about her life there. But she had learned to read and write somewhere along the way. And even though it was illegal, both for free and enslaved people to learn to read and write before the Civil War, some of them did it anyway. So Bishop Wesley Gaines did it. There's a story that he tells about his father purchasing books for him. So they were, you know, just little books, little readers. And he hid them because he heard the patty rollers were coming. What's a patty roller? Patrollers, the Klan, perhaps. And so he heard they were coming. They had spread the word around the black community where they were. And he hid his books in the ash hopper. Now, you may not know what an ash hopper is, but it's where the ashes would go from, like you might take the ashes out of the fireplace or out of from around the pot where you boil the water and wash the clothes, and you put the ashes there. And actually, you could use those to make lye. You mix it with water, and then it makes lye, and then you make lye soap from that. Okay, if you want the recipe, I've got it. My grandma gave it to me. But so he put his books in the ash hopper. Silly thing. That night it rained. So what happened? I just told you how to make soap, right? So the water turned it to lye and they ruined his books. But then his father spent the last money that he had was like $1. Again, a lot of money then, to buy him new books. That's how much his father thought of his child's ability. But he had to hiding the books. He had to hide that ability from whites because it was illegal. Later, he used his, just the idea of having educated black people in the world. He used it for himself and then also to help establish Morris Brown College in 1885.
So he was the founder of Morris Brown?
Well, it was a group of people. He wasn't the only one, but he was the one who went to the National Conference of Big Bethel Church. He went to the National Conference and the AME Conference, and he basically petitioned them and said, we want to start this college. So the idea was they had been approached by missionaries to start a college, and missionaries had started other colleges, Atlanta University, Spelman, other colleges, well, not Atlanta University, and then Spelman with Frank Quarles, but that's going way too far. Okay, back to your specific question. Yes, he was one of a number of people who were with the church, and he started Morris Brown College. Is that good? That's why I read the first part. I would never have gotten through that, right? Okay.
Yeah. Is Wilkes County the same county that Gone with the Wind was about?
I didn't think it was about Wilkes, but I don't know anything about Wilkes County.
The setting was in Wilkes County.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that because they have there's a Gone with the Wind sort of mansion or something in, what's the county? Is it Fayette? Okay. Yeah. I don't really know anything about Gone with the Wind. Sorry. Reverend James Tate was one of the earliest people to arrive in Atlanta after the Civil War. And when white missionaries arrived here in 1865, he was already teaching at a school that he had started with another gentleman. He was also one of the founders of Friendship Baptist Church, which was the birthplace of Spelman College, though unlike Morris Brown, Spelman had white a white president, basically white teachers for black women. So that was how that started, and it was many years into the 20th century. I don't know the date of when they got their first black, I will say, president, and then first black female president was even later. So he started a grocery business, they say, with just $6 in inventory. He didn't have much money at all. And some 20 years later, it's $6,000. So he made quite a bit of money. And he's considered the father of black business in Atlanta because of that. But during the Civil War, he was enslaved first in Elberton, someone told me, and then later in West Point, Georgia. And we know West Point, or I know West Point. I don't trust anybody's facts but mine. So I know it was in West Point because there's a letter that was written for him by the slave mistress to his wife and children in Mobile, Alabama. They had been separated. So this is one of those times, of course, that we know about during slavery where people, families, mothers and fathers and were separated. Husbands and wives were separated. Mothers and fathers were separated from their children. And this was an example of that. And they continue to look for, you'll see in the newspapers, there are all kinds of notices after the Civil War. And even into the 20th century, I was surprised to find people still looking for lost loved ones, people that had disappeared or had been sold away during the Civil War. They continue to look for them. I knew it happened right after, but I found some in the early 1900s where they're still looking for people that they lost, for children especially. So he and his wife actually were able to get back together, and he came to Atlanta and then sent for them, and they reunited after the Civil War, which wasn't always the case. Dr. Blanche Beatrice, she's also Saunders Thompson. Well, she has other names, but this is her second married name, so I'll use this one. She also graduated from Harry in 1901, and she graduated with honors. She was attending Atlanta University, I believe, but she stopped her education at 16 to get married. But her husband died, and she was sort of on her own at this point and decided she would go to school. The AME Church, an AME Church bishop, funded her, possibly Bishop Turner. His name isn't associated there, but possibly Bishop Turner, because he was in Atlanta and she was in Atlanta at this time. When she finished at Meharry, she opened a practice in Athens because they ended up going, just like Dr. Slater and Butler, they went to places where there weren't a lot of physicians for the population, but a large population of African Americans. So she opened the first practice by a black female in Athens, Georgia. And she's licensed as both a physician and a surgeon, both in Alabama and in Georgia. And she was part of the first drugstore, black-owned drugstore opened in Athens, which was the E.D. Harris drugstore. This is her marker that you see here below. And there's more of her name. Beatrice, Blanche Beatrice, I think her name is Bowen. I'm not sure who her father is because that information is not really documented. But I think it's an interesting story. I'm trying to find out more about her parentage. Because clearly she's a brilliant woman. She was also married the second time to Sidney James Thompson, and he was founder of Atlanta's oldest boys club, which would have been 1930. I think that says 33. That's my fault. I had them put it on there. But actually, I think it was 1932, so a year earlier. Now, someone was writing about this couple, and they changed it to say that he was a founder of Atlanta's oldest black boys club. Well, is that what it says? So where'd she get that, right? So I'm like, why'd you do that? So she changed it because she just assumed that I meant a black boys club, the oldest black boys club. No, this is the oldest one. It started in 1932 as a boys club. It became part of what we know as the boys club later. But the oldest white boys club in Atlanta is not this old. So I have a point to make here in that, people can't believe certain things happen because they just make assumptions about what, black people could and could not do. All right. Hope you don't do that. All right. This is her sister, Estelle Amelia Henderson. No relation. I looked. She was a member of the Alabama Bar Association, and she opened the first law practice by a black female in Georgia. In 1919, when she came to Atlanta, the Negro Press Association published an article in various newspapers making the announcement that she was opening a practice and that she had already passed the Alabama bar and then would be the first black woman to practice in the state of Georgia. So that's the source of that information for those people who doubt it. She was also on the Morris Brown College faculty, and she served as the college's financial agent. You see her name when you start looking at probate records. She did a lot of probate law, estate law. And so you'll see her name on various wills and probate documents if you're looking at the history of Atlanta. And even Gwinnett, there was one of someone who lives here, and I didn't look it up because I didn't make the connection until just now. But she was the person who was also given, she was the administrator of the estate. So she was given power to distribute the proceeds from the estate, which she liquidated it and did all of that. She also published a book. There's, again, a couple of notices in the paper announcing the book and its publication. And interestingly, it was endorsed by U.S. President Taft. I can't remember Taft's first name right now. What is it? William Henry? Everybody was William Henry, though. Doesn't it seem like that? Okay. All right. Forgive me for not knowing that. I did not look that up. Questions? But next slide. Okay, this particular one, some of you may know, this was our first African-American mayor, Maynard Jackson. He served 3 terms as mayor in Atlanta. He served as vice mayor, which not many places have vice mayors anymore, but he served as vice mayor of Atlanta first, and then went on to become mayor, served 3 terms. And some of his accomplishments are listed here. The neighborhood planning units, which was about local government, grassroots government, that is getting local residents involved in planning for what would happen to their communities in Atlanta. He also addressed concerns over police brutality. He ushered in MARTA and the Olympic Games and the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. He also helped with the airport and also with the city of Atlanta. More minority contractors were brought into the city business, I will say. But really, a large portion of city business, because he opened it up beyond white males, some of that went to white women. So just as many white women profited by some of the new policies that he brought in during his administration. Now, the marker itself, this is pretty fabulous. So if you haven't seen it live, my photo does not do it justice. Again, it's still there. I can go back. I can fix it. But 14 feet tall, 14 tons. It's granite. It's solid granite. There's about 6 feet of it underground just holding it up. Whenever you see something really tall in the cemetery, there's some third of it, quarter to a third of it's actually underground because it's got to be there to hold up that tall monument, tall, heavy monument. The granite comes from Georgia and Africa, which is to show the mix of his background. And let's see what, you'll see there's some symbols on it as well. Down at the bottom, you see those leaves, and in front, the green stuff, that's ivy. And so ivy is very popular in cemeteries, especially 19th century. It was used as ground cover, but it also clings, so it stands for or symbolizes tenacity and the ability to hold on. It can also symbolize strength, because if you're a gardener, you know, ivy goes up a tree and it can kill it and bring it down, even the largest oak tree. So it is a symbol of eternity as well, because it's evergreen. And she planted it in front of the marker, but then also put it on the marker itself. You'll see it at the bottom and then at the top. That circle at the top is the seal of Atlanta. These are all bronze pieces on the outside here. So the city of Atlanta, and then off to the right side, there's scales, because he was scales of justice, because he was a lawyer and interested in justice generally. For all people. And then on the left-hand side, I mentioned the airport, there's an airplane flying in the sky. And then on the back, the Olympic rings, which is very unusual. The Olympic Committee does not allow people to use that. It's only used within the business of the Olympic Committee, but they agreed to let it be used for this particular purpose. So a unique purpose so far. They may open it up and let other people use it, but this would be a unique use of it to have it on the back of his marker. And that's in alignment with his accomplishments there. And he's buried in the North Public Grounds of Oakland, not in the historic black section. This is still a city-owned section where individual graves were purchased, usually by people who didn't have family lots. And it was formerly the white section, we think, equivalent to the public grounds that were used for whites, for blacks, and Slave Square at the beginning when the cemetery was first laid out. This is in the original 6 acres of the cemetery. But if you become mayor of Atlanta, Oakland will probably offer you a spot as well. So there are other ways to get burial lots as well, though. So there are still some families who are willing to sell a lot and that sort of thing. So let's quickly go through these. Celebrating Black history at Oakland, there are other ways other than inviting me that you can actually learn about Black history at Oakland. These are African American history tours that we currently are doing. We Shall Overcome, which is African American stories from Civil War to Civil Rights, and Black Magnolias, a celebration of Black women in Atlanta's history. We also have a cell phone tour that's called African American Voices, where you can just listen on your cell phone as you walk around. We also have a general app for the whole cemetery, and you can download the app for, I think it's $1.99, and just use it on your phone and walk around. We celebrate Juneteenth every year, and this is usually a free. We just finished Black History Month tours at Oakland. We've been doing that for many, many years, and those have always been free. We decided to do that many years ago and have continued to do that. Juneteenth is also a free celebration that we do. Usually there are different events. We have tours, the activities for kids, as you can see on the far left over there. And usually we dress up. We like dressing up. So we usually wear costumes. Capturing the Spirit of Oakland is our Halloween event. It is enlightening, not frightening. Okay? So it really is. You'll see this particular woman in character. This is a storyteller, Deborah Strayhorn. She's in the character of, she's portraying Catherine Holmes, who was a free woman of color from Charleston, South Carolina, who came to Atlanta with a white family after the Civil War. She was never enslaved because her father purchased the freedom of her older brothers and sisters and her mother, and then she was born in freedom. Let's keep going. So you'll learn about characters like her. And that's not just Black history, it's just a history of the cemetery, but we have usually a couple of Black characters on that. Out of 6 characters every year, we have generally at least 2 Black characters. Sunday in the Park is our annual Victorian festival that we have in the late fall. This young lady's in costume. Again, we like dressing up. She started working with us as a volunteer for a community service project that she was required to do for her high school as a rising senior. And she is currently finishing her master's degree at Georgia Tech. She is conducting a study for wearable devices for heritage education, and she's conducting it at Oakland. So you wear a device and you walk through, and then it's a study, and you give feedback for that. If you're interested in doing that, let me know. I'll give you my contact information. She has a call out for participants now. But we're very proud of Candace. Candace Butts is her name. Leave you with this thought. History is not everything, but it is a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. That was by John Henry Clark. He's a historian. You should read him. Okay, next slide. I think we're done. Yeah, and you can support the Historical Oakland Foundation and our preservation efforts to make sure that people know these stories and that the information about the cemetery gets out there, because this property tells the history of Atlanta. And in doing so, it also gives historic context to the lives of African Americans. What I do in my book is I take that context, I place it into a broader context of state history, regional history, and also national history, just all coming from the cemetery. So for more information, you can jot down the phone number as well. You can call the phone number. They know about Candace's project as well in the office. Talk to the education director or the tour coordinator. And then you can also follow us on social media. through any of those? I think we're done. You got it? Okay. There you go. I just want to make sure I was done. Yes. Sure.
I may have missed it, but when they dug up all the graves and they did a mass burial, was it still in Oakland Cemetery?
Yes.
Or was it somewhere else?
No, it was somewhere in Oakland. We don't know exactly where. They're all, yeah, it was in Oakland. They left them. Now, okay, you've opened up a whole can of worms on this because I'm in the process of creating the chronology of exhumations at the cemetery. There was a lot of talk starting in 1877 when this actually happened through the 1880s, 1890s into the 1930s about digging up paupers and moving them, or digging up African Americans and moving them to Southview, for example, right?
How far away is Southview?
How far away is Southview? I don't know. Oh, from Oakland? Probably no more than 5 miles, right, guys?
So it's still
5 miles?
in the area.
Yeah. Well, it's still city of Atlanta. So, yeah. So not going to be too far away. Yes.
What percentage of the names of the people that are buried in Oakland would you say are annotated in Find a Grave?
Oh, virtually all of them, because we had a volunteer who made it her business to do that. She started several years ago. Whenever you look at something on Find a Grave, I found so many errors on Find a Grave, not necessarily in her work or just in her work, but I always double check from another source to clarify information on Find a Grave. But it's a very useful source. It's kind of like Wikipedia. It's a very good first stop to go there first, and then you'll find some clues to go somewhere else, or you can, start looking for things. Yeah. But yeah, there are in our current spreadsheet, there are approximately 12,400, something like that, African Americans who have been buried at Oakland at some point in time. Right. Other questions?
So even those folks that were moved, that were originally in the slave square or whatever that was called, those names as well, even though it's not identified exactly where they went, those names are still.
Yeah, what I just showed you, did you see the document several slides back, that pale yellow document I showed that you probably couldn't read, but that was just to give you an idea. Yeah, those names were recorded from 1853. Like I said, things were kind of iffy during the Civil War, but all of Oakland's record keeping, not just the black burials, it's worse with some of the black burials, I think, because they were reconstructing burial records after the Civil War, trying to piece those back together. And the sexton reported that he really couldn't do it for the black burials because they just hadn't written much of anything down. So, other questions? And this just scratches the surface. There's so much more. See, I took up the whole hour, and I meant to leave time for you to ask questions, but oh well. Anyway, that's why I'm doing the book, so I write as much down as I know. And even with the Southview book, as much as I could capture and write down, I've learned more since then. So that's the way it always is, it seems.
The names that are in the cemetery, they're like on public records. Can we get that information from, like, if we're looking for like a specific name or something?
You can call. Just go ahead and call the cemetery. That's how you got the information. So call and ask and they'll look up a name for you, or you can go by there if you want to do that and just visit. But yeah, they can do lookups for you to tell you if the name is there. Like I said, everybody, the records were not that great. So if you believe you have someone who's buried there, maybe they are. If they lived in Atlanta and died in Atlanta and didn't have any connection outside the city that you know of, between 1850 and 1884, when Westview opened, if it was that narrow time period, then chances are good they were buried there. But still, people were being sent back to their home counties or where relatives lived. So people were sent out of Atlanta to be buried. So not everybody, but a large number of people. It represents a large number of people. It's possible to study a lot of the health trends, death and dying, cause of death, and, how long people live, that sort of thing. So it's really our first records about the health of the people in Atlanta, because we didn't have a health department in the early days. Does that answer? Yes. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Come visit. It's interesting. There's more stuff. There's lots more, especially if you want to do the cell phone tour. You learn more about some of the people that are buried there, and just anytime. And we have lots of different tours. So watch the website for upcoming events. Oh, and there is for Southview, something I'm going to be involved in. We're doing a character tour. You saw the character that I was telling you about. We have 4 characters that we're going to bring to life in costume to tell their stories on March the 26th at 4:30 at Southview Cemetery. It's going to be good. So we have actors and storytellers doing this, and they're all good. So that'll be fun. Okay, I think I'm really done now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Henderson, for sharing this wealth of information and sharing these stories. I found very fascinating to hear about that. So thank you so much again for coming. And thank you, all of you, for coming to our Sundays in Suwanee. There's more information about our upcoming events and programs as well. So thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.